Hi there, I'm Mark Isero, and this is the Highlighter Podcast. Happy New Year, everyone, and I hope you're having a great start to your 2019. Thank you so much for listening to the Highlighter Podcast. As many of you know, this podcast is devoted to great conversations on race, education, and culture. If you happen to be a new listener, welcome, and I'm happy that you're here. Today's episode has two parts. First, there's going to be an interview, and then after that, I do want to share with you some of my plans for this podcast this year. I'm really excited about today's interview. The interview is with author Brian Broome, who wrote 79, one of my favorite top 3 articles of all of last year. In case you missed it and want to read it first, please do so. It's over at the Highlighter issue number 173. In this interview, Brian talked about how he became a writer, how he approached the piece, and how he organized 79, and what he hopes for the reader, what sort of feelings he wants to draw out of the reader as a result of his writing. Let's get right to it. Hey, Brian, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark. I appreciate your asking me to be on.
Yeah, I think it's really great. 79, as a lot of listeners and readers of the Highlighter know, was one of my top 3 articles of the year. So it's great to be able to talk to you. So thank you. I
Thank you.
wanted to ask you first, just backing up even before 79, how did you become a writer in the first place?
Well, I'm still sort of becoming a writer. I didn't start writing until about 6 years ago, and I know how long that was because that's how long I've been sober. I had some substance abuse issues for most of my life, and I went to rehab. And well, I didn't go voluntarily. my friends and family pretty much were like, you really have to go get yourself together. So I went to rehab, and I was in rehab a little over a month. And when you're in rehab, there's not a whole lot to do. So I started writing. They gave you like a little journal to sort of chart your daily thoughts, and my roommate snored horribly, and so I was just up nights writing, and I hadn't really considered writing before. And when I got out of rehab, I was afraid to go anywhere because my entire life had been about drinking and doing drugs, and I didn't want to run into those friends anymore. So I was at home a lot just writing, and I was writing a lot on social media. And a friend of mine who is a professor, Mike, said, you should try submitting some of this writing. And I was like, what does that mean? And he showed me how to submit a piece of writing. And the first thing I ever wrote and submitted got published.
Wow.
In I can't remember, the Ocean State Review. There's a story of mine in there from 6 years ago. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And so I just kept doing it and kept submitting. And I kept sort of getting things published. And I thought, well, why not try this? So that's how I got started.
That's great. And from the beginning, did you sort of have a sense about A, what you wanted to write about, and then also B, that there was something behind it, that it was actually pretty good, or did you doubt yourself at the beginning?
I still doubt myself. I don't. I write about a lot of things, but what ends up happening is that it always ends up being about race or sexuality or class or things in that in that circle. Like if I try to write a story about what I ate for dinner, it always ends up somehow being about one of those 3 issues. So yeah, I mean, I still have doubts. I have tremendous doubts. I don't, when you're sitting alone in a room and you're writing, you never know if it's, any good or if anybody's going to want to read it or if it's going to have an impact on anybody's life. So there are times when I feel like that's really awesome, and then There are times when I feel like what I wrote just really sucks. So it's always rewriting for me. It's never just about writing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if at the beginning you didn't want to get out of your house, that did give you some time to write. Because I know a lot of people who say that they want to write and then they don't actually write. So did you just get a sense of like, oh, I have a lot of time, so I can actually produce some good stuff and some not so good stuff?
Well, no, I mean I don't like writing. I mean, it's torturous. Um, just the fact of the matter is that you have to be still. You have to sit in silence. Those things are really hard for me to do. When I was afraid to leave the house, after rehab, it literally was a thing. Well, it's like I can't watch any more television. You know, I need to do something, and I'm afraid to go out, so I may as well just write something. Now I'm in a position where writing is pretty much required of me, um, and I'm learning to enjoy it more. I'm learning to put less pressure on myself and just know that nothing's going to fall out of my head onto the page perfectly, and that it's actual work. You know, it's not as easy as I think I thought it was going to be back in the beginning. I'm just going to write things and people are going to
Uh,
like it. No, 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 no. It doesn't work like that at all.
yeah, it's funny because I know it's a myth that the best writers most often don't like writing, that it's so painful. And
Oh,
it's not just people like me who, whenever I try to write something, it's very, very painful. And I have this idea, oh, the really good writers, it's easy, it's fun, but I've actually never heard that. So I'm sort of happy
yeah.
to hear that you think similarly
Oh,
around that.
it's torture. It's absolute torture. But I mean, I feel like, at the same time, I feel like I'm good at it. And so why not pursue what you're good at? Even if it hurts.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great. Is it okay if we talk a little bit about 79?
Absolutely.
I just, again, it's outstanding piece. Thank you. I wanted to first ask, did it come to you or was it a journey?
It was a situation where I was in that stage of not leaving the house, and my friend Mike, again, I owe a lot to my friend Mike, reached out and he said, "Hey, there's a contest in Pittsburgh, which is where I live, about the creative nonfiction um, is sponsoring a contest called Pittsburgh Neighborhoods, and what they want is for people to submit stories about their neighborhoods." Um, and I thought maybe you'd be interested in it, and I said, "Okay." And it was a competition, so I thought, well, nobody's gonna. I will try it, and nothing's gonna happen. And I wrote something about my neighborhood. And 79 didn't start off as it ended up on the page. It started off as just this rant. Um, it was a really, it was an I hate white people rant. And that's not what I felt. I don't hate white people. I hate sort of white supremacy and what it does to, people of color. But it was just this rant, you know, and I got a I got an email back and they were like, "Hey, you know, we would be interested in sort of pursuing this. You win." So there were I went to like a workshop. Creative Nonfiction had a workshop, and where we started to sort of more, I realized how angry it sounded, and just started to work on it more and more, um, and got it to a place where I was just literally talking about what's going on in my neighborhood and what was wrong with me. Why was I so angry at the people in my neighborhood?
Yeah, it's interesting because like you say that started as a rant against white supremacy, and then in the final piece, that whole epiphany, as well as sort of the strongest parts with wrath and with greed, come toward the end, and so it
Yeah,
it definitely seemed that that there was a long journey toward that point.
there was. It. I just in sort of self-examination, I realized that I wasn't just angry, at white supremacy. I was angry kind of at the people in my neighborhood for not for sort of flouting what is considered proper at the same time. So I had this kind of weird anti-blackness going with, a hatred of white supremacy. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting,
Mm-hmm.
because everything I wrote in the book, like I have thought, I have definitely thought mean things about people in my neighborhood who weren't living the way poor people should live.
Right.
Um, and then I realized, like, these are the same thoughts that your average white racist would have. You
Mm-hmm.
know, why? Where did I learn that? And that's kind of where the narrator's voice comes from. This guy who is not doing that great himself, just out of rehab, standing around judging everybody else and judging them particularly harshly because they're black people, and not being respectable black people. This sort of respectability politics of being black. That's what I was working with, and it really shook something loose in my head when I realized that I think like a white racist.
Right.
And where did I learn that? And that's where that narrator's voice comes from. I hope I answered your question. I think I just babbled,
No,
but
you totally did. And all of these thoughts, there's like a double thing happening. You have the bus, which is definitely personified. It's like this whole extra character in the piece.
yeah,
And you also have the seven deadly sins. So there's like this double sense of organization, which I found extremely interesting as well. Were those both in your mind at the beginning, or was that also part of the revision as well as the workshop?
well, I mean, those were not in my mind at the beginning. So I went and I wrote. Um, I decided to be honest with myself about my grievances with my you know, and one of them was like, there's so many. I live right next door to the projects, and I was thinking there's so many, women over there with too many kids. And then I would think about my neighbor. He's just a drunk.
Right.
Um, and then I would think about, my other neighbor, like, why is she buying that car when, and then as I started thinking about them more and more, those things just fell in line with like the seven sins: lust, pride, um, sloth, and I thought that's interesting. I bet I could pick out a thing that people do in my neighborhood that falls into that category. And isn't that religious analogy interesting? You know,
Yeah.
because this is a very religious neighborhood as well. Despite all the problems that go on. So I just thought that was interesting that my problems with my neighbors line up with this biblical, with stuff that I don't actually even believe in, with this biblical, hit list of how you shouldn't behave.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I would be reading something and say, I like that, but it seems like there was effort to get there. In your piece, I just felt like it totally fell into place. Like you didn't have to make up stuff or push too much. I mean, it seemed like the characters and your neighbors totally just fit in with the
Yeah,
sins. And then also, obviously, having the bus too, um,
right.
to be able to have a different scene totally worked as well.
Well, the bus
And
for me was like just symbolic because it just goes around and around, around and around. It's a circuit bus that doesn't really go anywhere. Um, it just gets you out of the neighborhood so that you can go other places. Um,
right.
so I thought that was kind of symbolic.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about your neighbor first. So I was reading along, and there's the first scene where you're on the bus, and then the kids try to shake it, and I'm like, okay, I totally know how that feels.
Right.
Um, and then in the second scene, I have to be honest, that hasn't happened to me. And so when your neighbor comes up and is not just drunk, but he's just so sorry, like
Yeah.
almost two or three meanings of the word sorry there, but he's full of contrition. And instead of not even answering, and instead of saying, oh, that's all right, you basically just get so angry at him. And there's just like this utter disgust. And that was the
Yeah.
first moment. That was the first moment I was like, oh, this piece is going to be different. Like, I was like, wow, this guy has something to say. And I wanted to ask, like, is that just like because that's happened to you, or what were you trying to get across with that first judgment?
Well, I think that I haven't read 79 in a while, but I think that at that point, I myself had just gotten out of rehab. Or no, I
Mm-hmm.
think I may have still even been drinking at that point. I think I was still drinking at that point. Um, and my neighbor was just me. I absolutely hated myself. It was my way. My disgust toward him was my way of making myself better than him. He was obviously somebody who was suffering with mental health issues. I didn't care about any of that. All I knew was that he was a drunk and that I had a job and he didn't.
Right.
And that I was managing my consumption and he wasn't. And that even with my sinister hangovers, was still managing to, I was going to get out of here. I was going to get out of this neighborhood. He wasn't. So in my mind at the time, I was just a better human being all around. And he was me. I'm looking at two versions of myself. This version that I'm behaving like that I want to be, and looking at him, which was me, which was the reality of who I was. I was just as drunk as he was every night. I just didn't bang on the walls and do all the things that he did. Um, and so that's where that disgust comes from. And also, I think black people judge other black people more harshly than we judge people of other races. And there's again, trying to interrogate that anti-blackness because my neighbor was, just everything that I was. He also lived up to some sort of stereotype that in my head of you know, this is why white people hate us. This is what white people say about us. That we're drunk and we're lazy, and that's what you are. Um, and that was another element of anti-blackness there. This racism, this internal racism that I learned from somewhere.
Yeah, and I felt like it just kept on going with the other characters, with the other stories. I mean,
Yeah.
you do have the black woman who has the car, who is filled with pride, and
Mm-hmm.
then you also have the teenage mom on the bus who has children who are swarming all over her.
Yes.
Um, and like these are just such strong, I guess, stereotypes or archetypes or something. And I feel like, but these are real people for you.
Yeah.
Like
They're
this.
definitely real people. I still live in the same neighborhood. Um, and apart from my neighbor who passed away, I still see these people. And it's been a while, so now, the but I don't look at them the same way. Obviously, I like to think that I've done a little bit of work on myself to know where these sort of anti-black ideas come from. Um, and yeah, they're definitely real people, and the same things that went on in my neighborhood when I wrote the piece are still going on now.
Yeah. And throughout the piece, you're going back and forth from judging them and then also saying that you're not going to judge them. And I found that was also so interesting because with your neighbor, it's like, no, I'm not him. And then with the woman with the car, you're like, I'm going to see her on the bus when she doesn't have that car, and I'm
Yeah.
just going to like look at her. Um, and you also say, but I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to judge the teenage
Right.
mom. And
Right.
it's just so interesting. Like when I was reading, I was like, can't he sort of understand what he's doing? And
Yeah.
I actually started getting a little bit angry and not have contempt. That's too strong. But I was
Right.
actually starting to feel, as a reader and as a white person, I was like, okay, what is he doing here?
Right.
And that's what I wanted to ask. Like, did you want me and your reader to have a reaction toward the narrator?
I did. Because it's I wrote 79. After I started to sort of like think about these things myself. So what I did was everything that's in the piece, like I thought for real, I was unlikable um, in that way because I was trying so desperately to be better than everybody around me in this neighborhood, you know. Um, and so when I stopped and I looked at that, I wrote the piece starting off as, the way that I used to think. And I sort of wrote how, I tried to write how the narrator goes through like this sort of evolution of like, okay, why do I think this? Where does it come from? Um, and how do I start to unthink these things? How do I start to unfeel these things? Because there's a reason why, this neighborhood is the way that it is. Um, and there's a reason why, somebody wants to buy a flashy car, and here's the other thing, like, it's not like white people don't do these things that I'm talking about in the book.
Right.
There's, there's white drunks who are terrible neighbors. There's white people who buy stuff that they can't afford. There's white women with kids, crawling all over them. And, but I was wondering why I was reserving all this judgment for the African Americans around me. And like I say, I do strongly feel that Black people judge each other more harshly than we do other races of people.
And why do you think that is? Is it because of capitalism and greed, basically the end of your piece?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. I had a talk with a friend the other day who was saying, well, it goes all the way back to slavery. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And she said, slave owners and masters used to pit Black people against each other so that there wouldn't be an uprising. And so they made us hate other Black people. When you're put in this, this sort of category where you're all of one thing, and that thing is hated, then you start, feel crabs in a barrel analogy.
Right.
You start climbing over each other, trying to be the one who makes it. And I definitely, so it comes from that. It does come from capitalism as well, and it comes from the fact that, the white supremacy has dictated a role for Black people in America, and that role is to take on all the ugliness, everything that white people are afraid of gets put on Black people's shoulders. Everything white people don't want to be or consider themselves to be gets placed on Black people's shoulders. We are more somehow criminal. We are more, salacious sexually. We are more vulgar. We are more loud. All these things that they don't want, white people don't want, they slough off onto Black people. And that is sort of our job, in America, it seems, to be the ones who take on the worst of human qualities. And that makes white people feel better about themselves, which
Yeah,
I think is the bottom line.
yeah, and I'm just thinking right now because when you switch in the piece to your realization, your epiphany, it's actually with a Black woman, an older Black woman,
Yeah.
who you see on the street or on the corner. And I don't know, it's interesting because obviously, like, it seems like this person has wisdom, but
Right.
also maybe has sort of like a historical sense, not just of the neighborhood, but
Mm-hmm.
perhaps of race and racial relations as well, and the
Yeah.
racism and the white supremacy.
Yeah.
Um, and then she basically says, if white people want the space and they want the spin classes,
Yeah.
they're coming.
Yeah.
And and immediately I feel something happened
Yeah.
in the narrator.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, is that also sort of what happened for you?
For me, it was more gradual. Obviously, within the confines of a book, like I couldn't chart like that gradual growth. But that's certainly where it started. She said to me, they are coming and they are going to do what they want to do, regardless of what we Black people think. And I also want to say that neighborhood that I was talking about there has completely changed. It's unrecognizable to me now. There's like fancy stores and shops and The complexion of the neighborhood has changed, literally. Um, it used to be, this neighborhood called East Liberty. It was a predominantly black neighborhood. Now you go there and there's like a bonobos. I don't even know what that is. Like, there's like a fancy coffee shops, and I think there's even like a Starbucks. I'm not sure, but they moved in. They basically did exactly what that woman
Right.
said. And there are fewer and fewer black faces in that neighborhood. So when she said, they just do what they want to do, and now I have to find someplace else to go. That sort of started the wheels turning in my head. They have taken over this space, and I wonder, if in some way they've taken over the way that I think about myself and my own people. And that's where the work kind of started. Like, I started really thinking about, why I was so harsh, or so much more judgmental, or expected so much more of other black people, and also why I didn't like myself that much. If I were to tell you that one of the reasons I didn't have, or one of the reasons I had or how do I say this? One of the reasons I think I drank so much and used so many drugs is because of my own self-hatred. Growing up I grew up around a lot of white people, in Ohio, and I went to school with predominantly white, and I think there's something in that process that I learned about, what white and black meant. And so rather late in life, I started interrogating that, and what the things I had been taught. I wrote the book for maybe other black people who have thought themselves thinking these kinds of things about other black people. That's who I wrote it for. And if white people get it, that's great. But like, I when I was writing it, I was thinking, okay, there's got to be another man or woman who maybe grew up around white people and learned these things without their permission, about black people, and how you had to, be respectable at all times, and how your poverty, the woman with the car that I wrote about, your poverty is a sentence. You should play out your sentence, and with dignity. Be poor,
Right.
and like it. Be poor and like it, and don't be buying flashy things, and be humble. All of which is bullshit. Why should we living up here just be satisfied with what we get? I was just hoping to maybe reach, some other African Americans who might be struggling with this very thing, internal anti-blackness. And I still struggle with it. I catch myself doing it. And I'm trying to work my way out of that.
I appreciate that you just talked about how you wrote for yourself, but also for other African Americans, because I think that as a white person, it's just very common that white people think that pieces are written always for them, and
Yeah.
sometimes maybe they're not.
Right.
And like, I know of other African American writers who have said, like, why does everything have to be for a white reader? And if a white reader is reading something, like, maybe it's also up to the white reader to sort of like deal with it as well.
Right.
And I think that's partly why I appreciate your piece so much, because you were talking about how you were interrogating stuff. I felt like I was also interrogated, and it's a
Right.
piece that I don't think that I'm going to forget for a long time. And it's also a piece, obviously, I wanted to share with a lot of people. And if they haven't, especially for white people, if they have not read your piece, I basically bring it over to them and say, you got to read this piece. Please do. I'm going to continue to do that. And I want to thank you so much for your time. Before we go, though, I want to ask you, are you working? I mean, obviously you're working on something right now, but what are you working on right now that you might want to talk about? And also, how can people, highlighter readers, follow more of your work?
Well, I have a website, brianbroome.com. which has all of my writing on it. Because of 79, this is great. Like when I got out of rehab, I went to college. I went to community college, and then I didn't really know what I was going to do. And then I went to Chatham University, and then I didn't know what I was going to do after I graduated from there. But because of 79, I submitted that as my writing sample to the University of Pittsburgh, and I got a full fellowship from that. So I'm now at the University of Pittsburgh as an Irvis Scholar, which is great because I have more time to write, which gives me time to write a book that I'm writing. I have an agent, and we're working on a book, and I've got a lot of great stories in there. But for right now, I have some things. Everything that I publish, I put on my website, brianbroome.com. And you can just read to your heart's content on that page. There's also my spoken work on there too. I do The Moth, and there's a few stories on there from The Moth that were recorded, and you can just follow everything there.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you very much, Mark. You have a great evening and Happy New Year.
You too. I want to share my deep thanks to Brian Broome for being on the show. Thank you so much for speaking to us, for being so generous, and for taking the time out to talk to the Highlighter community. I really, really appreciate it. Now, before I sign off, I did say that I want to share some ideas that I have about the show in 2019 and hopefully get some of your ideas as well. As you know, the Highlighter overall is all about reading. The newsletter comes out every Thursday. There's 4 articles or more. It's like 2 or 3 hours of reading. Obviously, we all totally believe in reading. And for many of us, reading is a private, solitary act, very individual. But for some of us, when we read something that's deep, that gets us to think a little bit more, that's potentially transformative, we want to talk about it. And we wish that someone else had read it too, so that we can talk together about the article. In short, we want to have a conversation. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, that is what the podcast should be about. That should be the heart of it. So I'm thinking of 2 basic formats, both focusing on articles, both focusing on conversation. The first format will be the interview format of an author, very similar to today's show. And the second format, what I want to do is invite Highlighter readers onto the show to talk about articles that they deeply care about. And actually to have more than one person on the show, if possible, talking about the same article so that we can get lots and lots of diverse opinions and so that people are really challenged to listen to each other and grow from that experience. And dear listeners, dear readers, this is where you come in. I want to challenge you to be on the show. You can give me a call at 415-886-7475 and leave a message, or you can go on the website highlighter.cc/guest and let me know that you want to be on the show and which article you want to talk about. I can't wait to find out who is willing and eager and excited about being on the Highlighter podcast this year. So don't be afraid, don't be shy. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. And with that, I want to thank you again for listening to today's episode of the Highlighter podcast. I hope you have a great week of reading, and I hope that you check out this week's edition of the Highlighter newsletter. Have a great week.